When you sign your name, it's called a signature. If you're a celebrity, an autograph. How about God? How does he sign his name? The Talmud records a story of how the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah begged with God at the end of the first temple period, when the temple was destroyed because of idol worship, begged God to please take away the desire, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination for idol worship. And the Talmud says that when they finished their plea and their entreaty to God, down came a little note from heaven with God's signature, signed not G-O-D, but Emet, the 3 Hebrew letters, Emet, which means truth. God's signature is truth. He is a true God. He is the God of truth. With that, we have to scratch our heads and wonder, how is it that in the Torah portion of this week, when God instructs Moses to instruct Pharaoh that the Jewish people are to be freed, he tells him, tell him that we want to take the people out for 3 days to the desert to make offerings there. And that is in fact what Moses conveyed to Pharaoh. Sounds like a bait and switch. There was no intention to just party in the desert for 3 days. It seems like an untruth. How would God be presenting Moses with a message to relate to Pharaoh that was factually, on the surface at least, not true? Especially given that God's signature is the signature of truth. Well, the technical answer is he wasn't actually lying in what he said, because he never ever said that the people would actually return. He just wasn't saying the whole truth. You know, there's an old Yiddish saying, a liegen soll man nicht sagen, a lie you cannot say, aber die ganze Emes, but the whole truth darf man nicht allemal sagen. You don't always have to disclose the whole truth. So technically, there's an answer as to how this wasn't really a lie. But we need something a little more compelling than that. So for perspective, we turn to the famous sage known as Reb Moshe Alshich, who was born in 1508 in Turkey and passed away in 1593 in Tzfat, in the city of the mystics in northern Israel of Safed. And he says this. He says the reason that God told Moshe to tell Pharaoh that all we're looking for is 3 days of celebration in the desert is because Pharaoh would not have had the capacity, the bandwidth, to hear of anything more than that. To be told that the Jewish people are on a one-way ticket out of Egypt would have been way too much for him to handle. And had he categorically denied the demand that the Jewish people take a one-way ticket out of Egypt, he wouldn't have been held accountable. The reason that the plagues happened, the reason that Pharaoh was being held accountable for his obstinance and for his refusal to allow the people to leave is because as far as he was concerned, what he was refusing the people was just 3 days of bringing offerings in the desert because Egypt was not a place where offerings to God could have been made. So for that, he was held accountable. And for that, the plagues were wrought upon him and upon the Egyptians until they finally came around to accept the request. That is the answer that's given by the Alshich. And what that says is that God did not overwhelm Pharaoh with a demand that was just too much for him to handle. Change takes time. It took 7 plagues until Pharaoh was even willing to entertain the idea of them leaving for 3 days. one of the takeaways here is that God understands what our capacity is. And God understands that change doesn't always come so readily and so easily. It's time. It's a process. And that's okay, so long as we're trending towards change. You know, there's a story about the Austrian emperor, Franz Joseph, who lived from 1830 to 1916. He once asked of the local community in Vienna to build an opera house. And the architects designed this magnificent opera house. And the day of its completion came, and they were going to have a concert with 3 tenors. And the emperor shows up in his royal carriage, pulls up in front of the opera house, doesn't even get out of the carriage, looks aghast, and he says to the architects and all of the designers and the planners who are all standing there waiting for this grand event, and says, "You fools! You made the opera house on the ground floor. That's not the way the opera works. The opera house has to be on the 2nd or the 3rd floor. People have to come up off of the street. People have to go into a different headspace to be taken by the music. You can't be changed by the music if you don't change your elevation, if you don't change your perspective." So change takes time. Now here's the thing. Even though it takes time to change internally, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't start acting differently even before we've changed internally. And that's another powerful takeaway from the Exodus. Because when the Exodus finally came, the Torah says the Jewish people bolted out of Egypt. Why did we have to run out of Egypt? Like in the middle of the night. Why didn't we leave in a more procedural, comfortable way? Why? Because had we lingered one more moment in Egypt, we would have assimilated into the abyss. God had to yank us out of there, even though we weren't really ready. And so what that tells us is that we can't afford always to wait for all of the internal work and the internal change to happen until we change the things that we do. We actually need to start from the outside in. We need to change the way we act first, and eventually our inner self will align with our outer selves. But change always starts externally, and from there to the internal. So the 2 takeaways from this Torah portion are: 1, change takes time, and that's okay. And God does not make demands of us that we don't have the bandwidth and the capacity to be able to execute. So God did not overwhelm Pharaoh with an intention of exodus that would be way beyond his capacity to be able to absorb. And the second takeaway is that it's okay to act in a way that feels duplicitous, like I'm not really there internally. That's okay. Just start doing the mitzvah, start doing the right thing, and eventually the feelings will follow. Please sign up for our YouTube channel. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for joining.